Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
The Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo, with 2 hours of good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. Coming up in the sphere of British politics, we'll look at the Labour Party's chances of a big comeback in Scotland as the Nationalists continue their tailspin. A recent poll suggests that Sir Keir Starmer's party could gain 23 seats at the next general election, which is handy if you're looking for an overall majority. I'll also be speaking to former MP Chris Mullin, who has been compared as a diarist to Chips Channon and Alan Clark, about his new book, which paints a vivid picture of our recent political history, covering the fall of the Labour government through Brexit to the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak suggested last week that China poses the biggest threat to global security. Do we need to be worried about another war if the People's Republic blockades or invades Taiwan? Scapa Flow in Orkney was the northern base of the Royal Navy during 2 world wars. After the first, the captured German fleet scuttled itself, and at the start of the second, a German submarine sank the British battleship Royal Oak. A museum reopens to tell those extraordinary stories. And we'll be discussing the work of Charles Dickens, with 2 very different adaptations currently on stage based on Great Expectations. All of that and much more after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The government is launching an ad campaign to stop people from crossing the channel. The advert, set to be circulated in Albania next week, will warn people they face being detained and removed if they make the journey. Critics have already branded it as pointless, saying it won't deter them. A record number of people made the crossing in small boats last year, and more than 6,000 have been intercepted so far this year. Meanwhile, Labour says it would impose time limits on hiring overseas workers in a bid to curb migration. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has told the Sunday Telegraph it would serve as an incentive to train British workers. She also suggested the party would ask the Migration Advisory Committee for appropriate timescales for importing labour. Former Defence Secretary Lord John Hutton says it's a balancing act and the economy also needs to be considered.
There's no easy solution to this problem, though. It's a global phenomenon. People are moving around. And I think we've got to certainly deal with the boats, the illegal entry. But I think we've got to take a very long, hard look at the other aspects of immigration policy. David Davis referred to families of students coming in and so on. I mean, I think there are things that can be done, but it's got to be done in a way that doesn't damage the economy and supports the growth agenda. I think these are important issues for us now, because I think securing economic growth is probably the biggest economic challenge that we face.
New details have emerged surrounding Philip Schofield's relationship with a young ITV employee. The boy was reportedly 15 years old when the pair met, with the Mail on Sunday saying the teen asked for help in getting a job. The TV presenter arranged an interview for him, which resulted in a junior position when he turned 18. The affair started later. Editor of the Mail on Sunday, Charlotte Griffith, says they were right to question the relationship.
It's so unprecedented. And he wrote to Katie Hind and said, "I don't expect any mercy," which is extraordinary. And it's because actually Katie had been very brave and done a story a couple of weeks ago that sort of went quite far to hint at this friendship. And he sent a complaint to Ipso and said, you know, the Mail has, you know, got this wrong, and of course we hadn't. And so he was right to apologise, but it's not very often in showbiz that people do a full mea culpa like that and say, don't show me any mercy.
7 people have been charged with the attempted murder of a police officer in County Tyrone. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot several times at a sports centre in Omagh in February. 2 men were also charged for being members of the IRA and 3 others with the preparation of terrorist acts. All 7 men will appear in court via video link tomorrow. Supermarkets could be asked to introduce a price cap on basic food to help struggling households. The government is reportedly drawing up plans suggesting the move, but a Treasury source told the Sunday Telegraph it would be voluntary. The scheme would see retailers charging the lowest possible amount for products like bread and milk. Food prices, which are expected to keep rising, have increased by 19.1% in the year to March. Russian airstrikes overnight have been described as the largest drone attack against the Ukrainian capital since the start of the war. Air raids sounded as the military worked to intercept the drones, with authorities saying 52 of 54 were destroyed across the country. The Air Force says Russia was targeting military and critical infrastructure. The Rail Minister says it's down to the unions whether nationalising Trans-Pennine Express services improves performance. The train operator is under government control from today, with services now running under a new brand name, Trans-Pennine Trains. The government hopes to reduce the number of train cancellations, but travel correspondent Simon Calder says we won't see improvements that quickly.
They have been having a miserable time, or more particularly their passengers have. In the first 4 weeks of April, 1 in 7 trains was cancelled. The government said this really isn't good enough. We're going to take it back into public control and we will try and make things better. But absolutely, Transport Secretary Mark Harper says don't expect a silver bullet. And I say your rail ticket still is something of a lottery ticket because of the high numbers of cancellations.
And thousands of people have taken part in the annual Isle of Wight Balloon Festival. The balloons were lit up for the Night Glow finale last night, which was choreographed to music and fireworks. Around 4,000 people gathered on each day of the bank holiday weekend to take part in the event. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Michael.
Thanks, Tatiana Sanchez. Well, there was chaos at British airports yesterday, once more advertising to the world that this is a country where almost nothing works. Who could imagine that we could be paralysed by an IT glitch that would close all the gates everywhere at once? It's a nostalgia day for those of us who remember Ted Heath's pathetic attempts to beat inflation by controlling prices. That seems to be Rishi Sunak's cunning new plan. And while Europe reels from the loss of oil and gas supplies from Russia, Sir Keir Starmer announces a way to increase our national vulnerability by ending exploration for oil and gas in British waters. Senior political correspondent for The Guardian, Aubrey Allegretti, joins me. What about these gates? I mean, it strikes me that because this is a Home Office matter and a civil service matter, that probably no one will be held responsible for this. I can't imagine that anyone will be criticised because, you know, now if you criticise someone, that can lead to the Home Secretary being under pressure to resign. So there's no satisfaction from the public here. We're plunged into chaos and we won't even get an explanation why.
Well, I think your summary at the opening of the programme was probably in line with what most people think, which is that very few things in this country seem to work anymore and people's exposure to politicians and the government is quite limited. But public services, they see and feel and experience every day. And we know that this was going to be a critical weekend for the sort of tourism and aviation industry. They were expecting this to be one of the busiest since COVID struck. And it's a bit of a dry run, really. I mean, if you look towards the summer, there's going to probably be sort of further issues. We know we always get issues with passport application backlogs, potential strikes amongst Border Force staff. So this is only going to compound those problems and make people, again, reinforce that feeling that nothing works.
I mean, IT is often a weak suit for the government, but I'll tell you an anecdote from my time in government. When I was Secretary of State for Employment, we were introducing an IT system to run job seekers' allowance. And there was a group in the room of senior civil servants and senior contractors from the consultants who were putting in the system. And I said, who is responsible for this? And the response from the group was to laugh. The idea that anyone was responsible was considered, even 25 years ago, laughable. And I fear this is the problem. No one is responsible. I mean, how can we have a system which is so vulnerable that a single failure closes all the gates all over Britain on one day?
There are questions about who exactly is supposed to be accountable here. And I mean, Suella Braverman's argument this week when she was under fire over the speeding fine, which obviously she's apologised for and Rishi Sunak's drawn a line underneath, was that she was getting on with the sort of day job and delivering on people's priorities. Well, again, people will want to see her focused on issues like this. And so it would probably be helpful for her to be visible and demanding that accountability if she doesn't think that there's anyone, at least in the sort of official or civil service side, who's willing to.
Mm. So I would say that inflation is caused by governments. Obviously, there are pressures which come from outside, such as, you know, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which has affected oil supplies and so on. But nonetheless, if you look at the inflation rates around the world, in Japan and in Switzerland, of course, inflation is hardly figured, whereas in a country like Britain, it is very high. And I hold the government responsible for that, the government including the Bank of England. I'm very critical of what the Bank of England has done. So what is the response of the government as it sees prices zooming out of control? It is to tell the supermarkets to hold down the prices of certain basic products. This is, I mean, to me, breathtaking naivety. I know nobody in the government is of an age to remember when all this was tried before. But in the Wilson years and the Heath years, this is what governments tried to do, to tell supermarkets not to put up the price of bread, as though this could affect the rate of inflation. I mean, inflation is, in a sense, a disease of money. It is money losing its value. And you don't change that by saying that you can't put up the price of a loaf of bread.
Well, Rishi Sunak is a sort of hostage to fortune here because he's committed to halving inflation by the end of the year. And we know that government figures are concerned about the latest inflation figures, which suggested that it dropped slightly less than certainly the city was expecting. And you've also seen core inflation at, I think, something like a 31-year high. So they're expecting that despite sort of small adjustments in, say, the prices of food for now, that actually this isn't a problem that's going away. And the government feels it has few levers to pull. Now, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, sat down with some of the supermarket bosses earlier this week and is trying to figure out how to help people where they'll feel it most. You know, the price of their weekly shop, that's how they'll be able to test whether or not they're feeling the effects of inflation very slowly coming down. But obviously, it's not happening as quickly as the government would like, and that has big knock-on effects the closer we get to a next general election. So they're looking sort of at more and more kind of wild ideas to help.
And as we approach general election, how extraordinary to hear a Chancellor say that he is willing to embrace the possibility of recession if that is the price that is needed to bring down prices. I mean, I think he happens to be right, but it's not a brilliant pre-electoral position.
No, it's an interesting one to have gone into this week, because you obviously had the IMF citing, you know, some better forecasts than expected, and it should have been a fairly triumphant week for the Chancellor, but instead he's generated these headlines about saying, yes, well, if we have to go into recession to bring inflation down, then so be it. But I think, you know, what's so interesting, particularly when you look at the France model for the price capping that's being talked about here, that was something that was looked at for short term. It was supposed to last for a quarter. The French government dubbed it a low inflation quarter. And I think Tory MPs will be feeling quite jittery because it was then extended by the French government for another one. And they'll be going, what sort of kind of immediate measures might we be taking now to try and make people feel better, but which end up being extended, and then sort of we lose the raison d'etre of what the Conservative Party means and is. That's what they'll be worried about, that we're looking at these sorts of issues now when we know how difficult autumn and winter is going to be as well, and there's going to have to be more emergency support on issues like this.
Even the expression raison d'etre is imported from France. Let's just think about this oil thing. It's interesting that Keir Starmer obviously still thinks that the politics are green. He still thinks that it is to his advantage to say that there should be no exploration for oil and gas in British waters. You would think that at some point the public might begin to wake up to what greenery, net zero as a short-term target, is going to cost the public. But for the moment, Labour thinks that the greener the better.
Well, you say British waters, and I mean, they certainly are, but I think we need to realise that he's looking at a very specific section of the electorate here when he talks about this, and we're talking predominantly about those in Scotland. So the SNP has not gone as far as to say that they will block or ban new oil and gas extraction in the North Sea. And that is what Keir Starmer is trying to do, open up a front there, another dividing line with both the SNP and the Conservatives, that they hope will put them on the path to electoral success in building the kind of coalition that they need.
Yeah, but this is a new politics too, because, I mean, in the old days, it used to be the case that industries going to places like Scotland were regarded as good news because there were jobs, and by the way, very high-quality jobs at that.
Yeah, Labour estimates that there are about 50,000 through the sort of green jobs that they plan to create. I think there's about 20,000 jobs already in North Sea oil and extraction offshore, and about 200,000 onshore. So they'll have to make sure that they're not doing anything that sort of damages that. But, you know, Labour is also trying to ensure that it has a energy security policy. And this is one of Keir Starmer's 5 pledges that he's going to flesh out next month. So we need to make sure that Labour explain exactly how they're going to do that, and whether or not you risk sort of turning the taps off in the North Sea. They wouldn't put it like that, but then making yourself more vulnerable to other countries.
Stay with me, Aubrey, because I want to pursue this Scottish question, because Sir Keir Starmer has been visiting Scotland this week. It's his 5th visit there so far this year. He's there to back his Scottish Party leader, Anna Sarwar, and he's hoping to recover at the next election a good number of seats, as the Scottish Nationalists are plagued by a police investigation into their finances. At the last general election in 2019, the SNP won 48 out of 59 Westminster seats, while Labour holds just 1. Before 2015, Labour had 41 Scottish seats. A recent YouGov survey suggests that Labour could recover 23 seats currently held by the SNP, which would help it towards a majority and make it less likely that it would need to buy nationalist support in a hung parliament. Olivia Utley is able to join us down the line, I hope. Olivia, Labour must be quite hopeful about what might happen at the next general election. Do you think they're justified?
Well, yes, I think Labour is feeling pretty hopeful. Obviously, Labour has a massive hill to climb at the next general election. To win a majority of just one seat, it needs to gain 125 seats. Now, that is enormous. And of course, if it is to gain that many seats, Scotland will have to play a crucial part. Labour used just to rely on Scottish votes for years and years and years. In some constituencies, there were Labour votes were weighed rather than counted. That is how massive the support for Labour was. Once it started taking those votes for granted a little bit, they started moving away, and we saw Ruth Davidson, who is a fantastic campaigner, win quite a lot of Tory seats. For the best part of a decade now, Labour has held just one seat in Scotland. But Keir Starmer is really hoping to turn that around. I've been speaking to some Scottish Labour insiders who say that getting Scotland back has been pretty much Keir Starmer's top priority. And it has to be said, he is, by the look of the polls, doing pretty well. Obviously, Hamza Youssef inherited a pretty poisoned chalice from Nicola Sturgeon, to say the least, and he's made a few unforced errors himself. He annoyed not lots of nationalists by, he had said that he was going to turn up to an independence rally in Dundee and bailed on it to go to the King's Coronation, which annoyed a lot of people. And Keir Starmer himself has been campaigning pretty hard in Scotland. So I think he is justified to feel quite optimistic. It was said after the local elections that it didn't look as though Keir Starmer was picking up very much momentum. It did show that the Conservatives weren't doing well at all, but the enthusiasm for the alternative didn't seem to be there, at least in England. But now this poll showing that his Keir Starmer's strategy for Scotland is working, I think is enough to make him feel quite optimistic, though I think it would be going too far to say that a majority is in the bag. There's still a very high chance of a hung parliament.
Yes, I mean, it is extraordinary the way that Labour recently has been trying to build a majority in the Westminster Parliament with only one representative from Scotland. That has been a very uphill struggle. Olivia, thank you very much for that report. Aubrey here in the studio, how do you see Labour's prospects? Do you think this is for real? 23 seats, is that a realistic proposition?
Well, Michael, I think they're helped, and you'll know this, by the fact that politics and in the run-up to the next general election, a lot of it is about momentum. And we're going to have a very interesting by-election in the next few months when the sitting MP, Margaret Ferrier, who is we're expecting about to be struck off for breaching COVID rules, steps down as the MP for Rutherglen and Hamilton if there's a by-election triggered and a recall petition in her constituency. Scottish Labour are pushing as hard as you could possibly imagine for it because they want that to be the first seat in the SNP wall that they managed to take back. Obviously, Margaret Ferrier is an independent MP, but she was elected as an SNP one. And they hope that that will be the first demonstration of the momentum that they've got to be able to win something like 20 seats back at the next general election, which would put them well on course to what they hope will be a majority government.
The catastrophe that Labour sustained in Scotland is one of the great disasters of political history. I mean, to think that, seats that were held by people like Gordon Brown were lost to the SNP, as I said a moment ago, that they went from 41 seats to 1 seat in a single election. Absolute catastrophe, which to some extent we in England have overlooked, not only because Scotland isn't England, but also, of course, because it led to a Conservative victory. So we weren't looking quite so much what happened to Labour. So Labour hoping bit by bit to get back to where it was in Scotland.
Yes, I mean, you just have to remember 2015 and the absolutely staggering swings that the SNP achieved. I mean, we're talking 25,000 votes. I mean, unbelievable to have 56 out of 59 MPs in Scotland, all Scottish national parties. And there's been very incremental progress by the Westminster parties to try and fight back. They've been handed a huge gift by the implosion of the SNP, but they can't just rely on that. So they're going to have to work very hard, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak included.
And there is Keir Starmer in Scotland, busy campaigning. Thanks to Aubrey Allegretti and to Olivia Hutley. You are watching Sunday with Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, as China earlier this week firmly opposed a trade agreement reached between the United States and Taiwan, tensions seem to be rising. How much of a threat does the People's Republic of China pose? I'll also be speaking to the sardonic diarist, Chris Mullin, about how he viewed the 10 years of political history. That's after the break.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Welcome back. Last week's G7 summit leaders united in expressing their concerns about China's economic coercion and militarization of the South China Sea. Beijing has since hit back and accused G7 countries of collaborating to smear and attack. The former United States National Security Advisor John Bolton also suggested earlier this week that the US and its allies will soon be tested by a crisis in the region. He believes that China is considering a blockade around Taiwan before attempting to take over this island democracy in the next 5 years. To discuss this, I'm joined by an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute who spent 22 of his 37 years in diplomacy in or on China, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Charles Parton, OBE, welcome to GB News. We don't often talk about the origins of this problem. We kind of take it for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about. What is the origin? What is the claim that the People's Republic makes over Taiwan?
Well, in 1949, when the People's Republic was set up and the communists won the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And therever after, China has wanted to get back Taiwan, as it phrases it. in their core interest, what they define as their core interest, they define Taiwan as the core of the core. And they made it a big thing with their own people that the Communist Party has been able to get back, as it says, all the territories that China lost. But Taiwan, of course, is the one that they haven't. It's, in historical terms, a specious claim, but that doesn't mean that the party doesn't put it out. And most Chinese believe it.
Yes, I mean, I have noticed in conversation with Chinese friends, Chinese people, that those who seem entirely rational for most of the conversation suddenly become extraordinarily excitable on this subject. So there's no doubt at all that for whatever reason, China and Chinese people feel very, very strongly about this.
They do. But again, I mean, I think all arguments aside, don't 24 million people have the right to decide under which system they live? I mean, that was the basis on which we went to war in the Falklands. So,
and they were just 2,000 or thereabouts.
Correct.
Very good. OK, now, let's take John Bolton's analysis. John Bolton believes that there could be a blockade. His argument is that China will want to test the allies, so, a bit-by-bit approach, but also that if it takes over Taiwan, it wants to take it over without having smashed it to pieces in the first place. It wants to take over the very valuable infrastructure and the very creative people. How worried are you about a military action, including the possibility of a blockade?
Well, it depends what you mean by a blockade. If you mean a blockade that goes on until Taiwan surrenders, then I don't think that will happen, because that's the equivalent of an invasion. And in one sense, China will be blockading itself. I mean, Taiwan exports about 185 billion worth of mainly components and semiconductors, etc., to China every year. That goes into China's exports, so those would cease to be exported. That would cause immense economic dislocation within China, unemployment and unrest. And I think the whole question of invasion is also on the same lines, but on a much greater scale, because, of course, foreign trade and investment would dry up. There's no guarantee that the semiconductor industry in Taiwan would survive. In fact, I think it wouldn't, because spares and machinery certainly wouldn't be allowed in. And that would cause a cratering of the world economy, a cratering of the Chinese economy, mass unemployment in China. There isn't a social security net. There would be riots and unrest, angry, hungry people. All good things come from the Communist Party, but the obverse of that coin is that all bad things are blamed on the Communist Party. I think that's an existential threat to the regime.
Well, I mean, just to argue against you for a moment, I mean, all those things could have been said, or most of those things, sorry, could have been said about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are all sorts of reasons why one could have argued that that was not in Russia's interest, and yet it happened. The Communist Party in China has such control that, according to I think the most recent biography of Mao Zedong, he killed 50 million people through famine, and the Communist Party remains in place. So it isn't evident to me that the Communist Party in China is particularly susceptible to public opinion.
I think it is, actually. I mean, that was then and this is now, and I don't think there is actually a meaningful comparison with Russia. I mean, Putin believed that he could go in and win within a few weeks, if that. And Putin's position within Russia is a lot more different from the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. Although Xi Jinping is extremely powerful within the party is still systematic, it's structured, and ultimately I suspect it might be bigger than him. But there's a massive difference between rolling across Ukrainian plains, you hope, and a military venture across 100 nautical miles of very rough seas, which only allows you to do that at certain times of the year, a very narrow window. You've got to mobilise probably 2 million men by the time all the logistics are there. It's just, and then, as I say, the economic consequences which the party can see, you would have to be immensely irrational, nevertheless, to ignore all that. And I don't think, as far as we can see, that Xi Jinping is irrational.
Well, in that case, why all the bellicosity? What is to be achieved by all this warlike talk if it's not actually about an invasion?
Well, the aim of the Communist Party is to convince the Taiwanese and to convince the world that, as they call it, reunification, more sensibly probably unification, is irresistible and inevitable. And part of that is by piling on the military pressure and making people think that they would or could or would invade. So that's just part of it. But there's a whole range of other measures that they have been, and I am sure will be, doing in the near future, including possibly biting off one or two. There are small islands which belong to Taiwan, very close to the Chinese mainland, the closest within 2 or 3 kilometres, and others in the South China Sea, which Taiwan occupies. I wouldn't rule out an occupation of those, because that would be a challenge both to the Taiwanese and the Americans, as is that big enough to go to war over or really fight on. Yes, I mean, sure, it's not going to be a pleasant ride over the next decade or two, but I think serious blockade and serious invasion is not on the cards.
I very much hope that you're right, although I must say even the prospect of some of the islands belonging to Taiwan being seized and the Allies being tested in that way is not something to look forward to. But thank you very much indeed, Charles Parton. The former Labour Member of Parliament for Sunderland South, Chris Mullin, has just published his 4th book, featuring his diaries from when he retired from Parliament in 2010 through to 2022, painting a vivid portrait of our recent political history. The diarist and novelist played a key role in freeing the Birmingham Six, who were Irish men wrongly convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1974 Birmingham pub bombs. The new book, Didn't You Used to Be Chris Mullin, charts the collapse of New Labour, the long years of austerity politics, the highs and lows of Brexit, the rise and fall of Jeremy Corbyn, and no fewer than 4 Tory Prime Ministers, and ends recalling the death of Queen Elizabeth II last year. Chris Mullin joins me now. Hello, Chris. It's a great pleasure to have you on GB News. Welcome.
Thank you.
I very much enjoyed the book because when you read somebody's diaries, you're reminded that as we went along, we didn't know how things were going to end. We didn't know what was going to happen next. And of course, because you haven't doctored your diaries, we see your opinions at the time, some of which, turned out to be wrong. But there they are in your diary. You predicted things incorrectly. So all of that is very, very interesting. But as you say, you used to be Chris Mullin. So sell the book to me. Why would someone want to read the diaries of someone who had already retired from Parliament at the beginning of this book?
Well, the 3 previous volumes were widely acclaimed, and this one is really just a continuation. If you like the 3 previous volumes, you're liable to be interested in this one. And it is an account, really, from someone no longer in the tent, but not entirely out of it, of our last 12 turbulent years. The difficulty arose as to where to end it. I did think the fall of Boris, which seemed inevitable, and in due course came to pass, would be a good moment. But then the Queen died, of course, and that was the obvious end of the era. So it stops there.
Now, can we begin with the man that you call the man? That is, say, Tony Blair. I wasn't sure whether you were being ironic, but at one point in the book, you yearn for the strength of leadership that there was under Tony Blair. So I don't know whether that was an ironic comment, but how do you assess that career now, looking back?
Well, it wasn't intended to be ironic. My take on Tony Blair is that he was the outstanding Labour leader of my lifetime, but I do have one big bone to pick, of course, and that was that he allied us umbilically to who I used to say was the worst American president of my lifetime. But he, of course, George Bush, has since been trumped.
All right. Turning to Brexit, I think your constituency was the first to declare, your former constituency was the first to declare in the referendum, and it declared very, very strongly for Brexit. But, of course, you were a Remainer. Do you think you misunderstood your constituents? Did they take you by surprise? What were you missing about all that?
Well, I wasn't surprised by the outcome. Sunderland has always been, with no disrespect to the people who live there, a fairly insular city, and I used to get into trouble regularly for taking a detailed interest in things way beyond the roundabout on the Riot Road. As far as Brexit's concerned, I do think the so-called metropolitan elite did misunderstand the depth of feeling in some, particularly in the Labour strongholds in the poorer areas of the country, where I think the the main driving force behind it was fear of immigration. Although Sunderland's actually done rather well out of the EU, and one could occasionally see people being interviewed in front of a board which said this project is funded by the EU, saying why it was all a terrible thing and how nothing had improved. And of course, they've got the Nissan car plant, so it was which really has made a difference in Sunderland. And so it was a bit of a gamble, which may not entirely be over yet.
And briefly, there are
voting leave if you lived in Sunderland.
And briefly, there were so many things in the book, of course, we could talk about anybody, but your somewhat complex relationship with Jeremy Corbyn. What did you make of Corbyn becoming the Labour leader?
Well, my view on Corbyn is that I've known him for about 40 years, and he's a thoroughly decent human being, but he would have made an absolutely hopeless Prime Minister. So whilst I deprecate the way in which he's been treated, both in the press and by the present management of the Labour Party, I didn't vote for him to become leader. I'm afraid, dear old Jeremy, he's a pacifist, he's a Green, he's a vegetarian, he's not in favour of killing anything or anybody. And as I say, he's a thoroughly decent human being, but just not cut out for the top job.
Chris, I very much regret that we don't have
you have to say no to people. Say again?
I very much regret... Sorry, Chris. I regret we don't have longer to talk about your book, but I'm very happy to plug it here. Didn't You Used to Be Chris Mullin? This covers your diaries from 2010 to 2022. As you say, your last volume of diaries was a great success. I very much hope that this one will be as well, and thank you for coming on GB News.
Thank you for having me.
You're watching Sunday with Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, how has the work of Charles Dickens been adapted for today's audiences? We'll be looking at two of the latest revisionings of Great Expectations, including by the comedian Susie Eddy Izzard. She has a one-woman adaptation. That's all after the break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Dubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Sunday with Michael Portillo. Shortly after the end of the First World War, the captured German fleet was disarmed and impounded at Scapa Flow in Orkney. Under the noses of the British, the German crews succeeded in scuttling their ships to deny their use to the victors. The wrecks are a popular attraction for recreational divers today. The opening months of the Second World War are known as the Phony War, but not in Scapa Flow, where a German U-boat torpedoed HMS Royal Oak with the loss of 835 lives. The Scapa Flow Museum tells the story of the Royal Navy's northern base. The museum has undergone a £4.4 million redevelopment and is one of 5 shortlisted for the Museum of the Year award organised by the Art Fund. I'm joined now by Nick Hewitt, Culture Team Leader of the Scapa Flow Museum. Welcome to GB News. Very good to have you. Can you explain to people why the Royal Navy had a base in the Orkneys? What was the advantage of Scapa Flow, the natural advantage?
Oh, thanks, Michael. I'm really glad you asked me that question. The Royal Navy comes to Scapa Flow because Orkney only makes sense when you're at war with Germany. So if you think about the centre of gravity, for centuries, Britain was mainly fighting France, and all our bases were on the south coast of England. Suddenly there's a war with Germany. You need to move somewhere else. Scapa Flow and Orkney are the stopper in the bottle of the North Sea, and Scapa Flow is the finest natural harbour in the British Isles. So it makes sense geographically to move the fleet here, but the fleet has never been here, so there's absolutely no infrastructure at all. They're coming up here from a standing start.
And that story of the development of the base is one of the things that is covered in the museum, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely right. We pick up the story with the arms race with Germany before the First World War. We look at the move of the fleet here in 1914. We look at the story of the First World War, and then as you did in your intro about the internment and scuttling of the German fleet. Then we look at the extraordinary efforts to salvage that fleet in the interwar period. And then, obviously, at the end of the First World War, they dismantled everything, thinking that'll never happen again. And in 1939, of course, they're back. And we look at that extraordinary story of the Second World War, when at Lyoness alone in Hoy, which is where the museum is, a community of 12,000 service personnel and civilian contractors grew up. So if you imagine that the population of Hoy at that point was about 450, that was an extraordinary impact on society in Hoy and in across the Isles more widely.
The scuttling at the end of the Great War is an extraordinary thing because, of course, the Germans were held on unarmed ships and they were meant to be incommunicado with each other. And yet somehow they managed to pull off a completely successful conspiracy in which they all scuttled their ships simultaneously to the absolute dismay of the British. I mean, this would constitute a major scandal, the failure of control by the British, which allowed the Germans to do that.
Yeah, I think there was undoubtedly an element of complacency. I mean, it was phenomenally well organised, as with anything else in war. And we have to remember the armistice in November 1918 was essentially a ceasefire. It wasn't the end of the war. All this is going on while the peace negotiations are taking place in Versailles. In war, sometimes the other guy gets it right. And this was undoubtedly one of those occasions. The Germans passed messages. They prepared their ships in secret. There are various things you can do to ships to make them sink fast, and they did all of that. A pre-prepared signal was circulated. There were a number of occasions where they thought they might have to do it, because the plan was that if there was any danger of fighting breaking out again, as you pointed out, the ships that had the breech blocks removed from their guns, they were de-ammunitioned, and most of the crews had been sent home. There were only skeleton crews, so they couldn't fight. So the only weapon at their disposal was to sink their own ships. And then 21st of June 1919, this is exactly what happens. They believe that fighting is going to break out again. The signal goes out and all the ships sink. At the same moment, pretty much, they begin to sink.
Quite extraordinary. And let's just very briefly touch on this other disaster for the British, which comes in October 1939. The period we think of as the Phony War. You can easily overlook this event, but a British battleship is sunk at Scapa Flow by a submarine with 835 people killed. An extraordinary moment.
It is, and it's, as you again rightly say, the Phony War was never a phony war for the Royal Navy generally. The Royal Navy is at the sharp end as soon as the war begins. They return to Scapa Flow. Much of the base infrastructure from 1914-18 has been dismantled. They are slowly beginning the process of reassembling it. The eastern entrances to Scapa Flow have been closed by what they call block ships, so old merchant ships that have been scuttled to block the channels. But they were done in the First World War, so they're starting to disintegrate. They're shifting position in the seabed. There are spaces between them. And Gunther Prien, the German submarine commander, in what has to be acknowledged was an extremely audacious and well carried out operation, threads his submarine between the block ships, comes into Scapa Flow. Most of the fleet has gone. Royal Oak, which is an older battleship, hasn't been modernised, has been left behind as an anti-aircraft defence, really, for the radar station. So she's operational, but she's too old to go out with the fleet. Both sides are learning how to do this. Prien's first attack, his torpedoes malfunctional miss, but nobody's watching, so he's able to go away and reload. He goes out into the flow, turns his submarine, reloads, comes back again, and then hits Royal Oak with 3 torpedoes. And it's absolutely catastrophic. As you say, she sinks fairly quickly. She rolls over, 835 lives lost. And it's a severe blow. It's commented on by Churchill in the House of Commons, who references the audacity of the attack, but also makes it clear that something has to be done. And we have a lasting legacy to that in Orkney today, because the solution they arrive at, one of them, is to actually permanently block those channels. So we have the Churchill barriers that join the South Isles to the rest of Orkney.
You have the most amazing military history in Orkney, and that's now represented in your modernised museum. And many thanks indeed for telling the story so well, Nick Hewitt. So we're talking about the Art Fund Prize, and the other museums that are shortlisted are the Burrell Collection in Glasgow, the MAC in Belfast, and Leighton House and the Natural History Museum, which are both in London. Well, according to the advertising blurb, this spring, several leading British comedian and acting talents are taken to the stage for the career-defining role of the narrator in a new comedic adaptation of Dickens's tale, revisioned as Bleak Expectations. Based on the award-winning Radio 4 series by Mark Evans, Bleak Expectations is, it's claimed, a joyfully anarchic journey through Dickensian London and beyond, following the heroic misadventures of young Pip Bin as he battles against mistaken identities, contemptible conspiracies and surreal plot twists in his quest to save his family and find true love. Arts editor of the Express Online, Stefan Kyriazis, has been to see it. Good to see you again. What did you think of it?
It's huge fun. It's jolly japes. It's like a blancmange of silliness. Lots of Dickens is quite an easy target. So you have lots of silly names. The villain is called Gently Benevolent. There's a suffering spinster, but she's only 23 or 24, who's called Ripely Fecund. His father is killed by penguins. And tragic, was it an accident? There was mackerel paste secreted on his suit. So there's lots and lots of silliness. His mother goes mad and locks herself in a grandfather clock. And then the horror, craziness, starts fighting for workers' rights and women's rights. So there's lots of silliness. And they carry it all along. There's a huge amount of energy. It's a bit like the play that goes wrong. There's a whiff of Blackadder to it. Fun.
But very good fun. It doesn't seem particularly to be close to Great Expectations, but another item on stage is very close to Great Expectation, and that is Susie Eddy Izzard's one-woman show. in which, amazingly, she plays 19 roles in an extraordinary feat of memory, surely.
Yes, it is, absolutely. And there are little moments and tiny little wobbles, but it's a very collaborative thing. You can feel the audience. It's rather like, we know that she's run all these marathons and you cheer along. There's this energy to the audience. And it's an incredible feat. A very gifted performer, mimic, comedian, knows how to tell a story. Lots of the comedy was always quite surreal. It was building a story. So all of this is brought in. Lots of funny accents, hugely expressive eyes and mouth and hands, and great physicality. So all of this is beautifully deployed. First act is very much storytelling and hugely enjoyable. You're being told the story, but also everything is the groundwork's being laid in. Second act, I have to say, it all came together. And Susie, she starts truly inhabiting the characters, and you could feel the audience was there. There was absolute pin drop when Pip declares his love to Estella, which is heartbreaking. Miss Havisham's tragic end is so vivid, and this is just one person there, being Miss Havisham, then being Pip looking down, but you can see the flames, you can see the insects and spiders scuttling across the floor. There's a tremendous boat escape at the end, and you describe the bridges passing by and the buildings on the bridges and the banks of the river and the mist and the paddleboat steamer coming in, and we were all absolutely rapt. And very much, I guess, Dickens used to tell this as a story. He used to tell this in theatres and actually tell it to audiences. So it's built for that already. There are natural pauses. I think we all think we know Dickens, and I kind of do. We know Dickens. There were so many gasps in the audience at revelations of secret parentages and benefactors and sudden marriages that the audience was totally going with it. And you got that kind of dun-dun-dun end of each episode. And the audience responded. It's a tremendous accomplishment.
Wow. So would that be your top recommendation, perhaps more than Bleak Expectations?
Very, very different. Enjoyed both. Bleak Expectations is huge fun. And it has to be said with Susie, we've got a one-woman Hamlet possibly coming up soon, still being workshopped, but also an intention to stand for Parliament in the next election. So if this happens, catch her while you can.
Yeah, no, she's an important activist, and she's very much aiming to go in as a Labour Member of Parliament. She was very briefly a substitute on the Labour National Executive. Dickens, as you say, toured not only Britain but Europe and the United States extensively, reading out his books, but he only read them out in English, whereas Susie Eddy Izzard does stand up in French, in which she's fluent, in Arabic. I think that may be the influence that she was born in what is now Yemen. She was born in Aden. But she's also learnt to do it in German, Spanish and Russian. I mean, this is a Renaissance figure.
It's phenomenal. And I'm schoolboy French, but I went and looked for it online, remember years ago, just to watch. And fluently, you know the jokes and the rhythm and the cadence and the voice. The audience, huge arena audiences, laughing along. It's extraordinary. But she's been very clear with the marathons, with tackling this new Dickens. They're not just sort of performative challenges just for the hell of it. It's the personal pleasure of triumphing over something and also doing what people think she can't do. A life of being told you can be like this, you can't be like this. So there's always just this thrill of discovering new aspects to herself as well. And it's hugely inspiring and brilliant to watch.
A remarkable biography. Just very briefly indeed, do you want to say anything about other Shakespeare? David Copperfield, you're going to say a word about?
I absolutely love, I can't highly recommend it enough. We've had these not great recent TV adaptations that are just turgid. If you want to watch something, watch Dev Patel in David Copperfield. This is how you update Dickens in another way. You make it modern, relevant, pacey, inclusive, and hugely entertaining. Gorgeous. That's my tip.
Many thanks to Stefan Kyriazis. You're watching Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. In the next hour, legendary jazz musician Louis Armstrong had a secret daughter who is the star of a new documentary film released in the UK this weekend. I'll be talking to her about how she did and did not connect with her famous father. That's all after the break.
This is Boston, or at least a part of it anyway.
What we voted for has backfired.
You don't see many locals about anymore.
Do you feel as though you've got what you asked for?
No, not at all.
From my point of view, yes. From a business point of view.
This was to campaign to just to get a referendum.
Just to get a referendum.
We need people like Nigel to grab it. Come on, lead the country.
They tell us at elections what they want us to hear, but they never actually really mean it.
We're proud to be GB News, Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo with more conversation, arts and entertainment. Coming up in this hour, I'll be talking to a university student who finds himself amongst a group of 100,000 dissatisfied students who took universities to the High Court this week for inadequate teaching. One of the greatest jazz influences in the 20th century, the legendary Louis Armstrong, left us with a wonderful world, but also a secret daughter. I'll be talking to her. Her name is Sharon Preston-Falter, the star of a new Emmy-nominated documentary exploring her relationship with her father. This week, Tate Britain has unveiled the first comprehensive rehang of its collections after 10 years, putting the works of previously forgotten and female artists at the centre of its displays, but consigning some old favourites to the storeroom. Is it wokery again? What is it like to photograph the biggest and brightest British societal celebrity figures, including Princess Diana, Elizabeth Taylor and Mick Jagger? I'll be speaking to Richard Young, a celebrity photographer for over 50 years. And I'll be joined by an award-winning designer of a coronation cake presented to their majesties at Windsor Castle. Crumbs. That's all after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you very much and good afternoon. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. ITV sources have told GB News bosses have just 7 days to save this morning following the fallout surrounding Philip Schofield. Staff members who raised concerns say executives need to prove they're properly addressing the issue and they'll need to win back the trust of viewers. It's as new details have emerged about the presenter's relationship with a runner who was reportedly 15 years old when they first met. The Mail on Sunday says Philip Schofield arranged an interview for him, which resulted in a job when he turned 18. The affair started later. Editor of the Mail on Sunday, Charlotte Griffiths, says they were right to question the relationship.
It's so unprecedented. And he wrote to Katie Hind and said, "I don't expect any mercy," which is extraordinary. And it's because actually Katie had been very brave and done a story a couple of weeks ago that sort of went quite far to hint at this friendship. And he sent a complaint to Ipso and said, you know, the Mail has, got this wrong. And of course we hadn't. And so he was right to apologise. But it's not very often in showbiz that people do a full mea culpa like that and say, don't show me any mercy.
The government is launching an ad campaign to stop people from crossing the channel. The advert, set to be circulated in Albania next week, will warn people they face being detained and removed if they make the journey. Critics have already branded it as pointless, saying it won't deter them. A record number of people made the crossing in small boats last year, and more than 6,000 have been intercepted so far this year. Meanwhile, Labour says it would impose time limits on hiring overseas workers in a bid to curb migration. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has told the Sunday Telegraph it would serve as an incentive to train British workers. She also suggested the party would ask the Migration Advisory Committee for appropriate timescales for importing labour. Former Defence Secretary Lord John Hutton says it's a balancing act and the economy also needs to be considered.
There's no easy solution to this problem, though. It's a global phenomenon. People are moving around. And I think we've got to certainly deal with the boats, the illegal entry. But I think we've got to take a very long, hard look at the other aspects of immigration policy. David Davis referred to families of students coming in and so on. I mean, I think there are things that can be done. But it's got to be done in a way that doesn't damage the economy and supports the growth agenda. I think these are important issues for us now, because I think securing economic growth is probably the biggest economic challenge that we face.
7 people have been charged with the attempted murder of a police officer in County Tyrone. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot several times at a sports centre in Omagh in February. 2 men were also charged for being members of the IRA and 3 others with the preparation of terrorist acts. All 7 men will appear in court via video link tomorrow. Supermarkets could be asked to introduce a price cap on basic food to help struggling households. The government is reportedly drawing up plans suggesting the move, but a Treasury source told the Sunday Telegraph it would be voluntary. The scheme would see retailers charging the lowest possible amount for products like bread and milk. Food prices, which are expected to keep rising, have increased by 19.1% in the year to March. 2 Just Stop Oil protesters have been charged after disrupting the Gallagher Premiership rugby final at Twickenham. 37-year-old Dr Patrick Hart from Bristol and 40-year-old Sam Johnson from Essex ran onto the pitch and threw orange powder onto the field. Play was suspended as the men were escorted from the stadium. They've been charged with aggravated trespass.
Russian airstrikes overnight have been described as the largest drone attack against the Ukrainian capital since the start of the war. Air raids sounded across Kyiv as the military worked to intercept the drones, with authorities saying 52 of 54 were destroyed across the country. The Air Force says Russia was targeting military and critical infrastructure. The government says it's down to the unions whether nationalising Trans-Pennine Express services improves performance. The operator is now under government control, with services running under a new name, Trans-Pennine Trains. It's hoped the move will reduce the number of cancellations. Travel correspondent Simon Calder doesn't believe any improvements will be seen soon.
They have been having a miserable time, or more particularly their passengers have. In the first 4 weeks of April, 1 in 7 trains was cancelled. The government said this really isn't good enough. We're going to take it back into public control, and we will try and make things better. But absolutely, Transport Secretary Mark Harper says don't expect a silver bullet. And I say your rail ticket still is something of a lottery ticket because of the high numbers of cancellations.
And thousands of people have taken part in the annual Isle of Wight Balloon Festival. Hot air balloons were lit up for the Night Glow finale, which was choreographed to music and fireworks. Around 4,000 people gathered on each day of the bank holiday weekend to take part in the event. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Michael.
Thanks, Tatiana Sanchez. Well, university is an experience that enhances the learning, the lives and the prospects of many young adults. It involves classes, lectures and direction of studies, as well as a period spent in the company of other students and teachers, which can enhance social skills. Oxford Brookes University student Harry Patano Heathcote thought that those would be his experiences when he began a degree course in law and business in 2020. But having started his studies during lockdown, his course actually comprised a set of pre-recorded YouTube lectures and textbooks to be read in lockdown student halls. Harry is now one of 100,000 members of student group Claim, who landed University College London in the High Court this week, the largest ever case brought against Britain's universities. The hearing concluded on Wednesday with Judge Barbara Fontaine saying she would give a written ruling at a later date. I'm joined now by Harry Patano Heathcote and lawyer Richard Dunleavy, who's a partner at Harkers Parker, one of the two law firms enlisted to deal with the case. Harry, welcome to GB News. Tell me about your university experience. What was unsatisfactory about it?
Well, it was sort of unsatisfactory from the get-go. We arrived, we had sort of 2 weeks before we were all sent into lockdown. And then we were, put onto the YouTube videos, weekly Zoom calls with our lecturers. And, well, we were kept in halls as well. So it wasn't really a university experience.
Some people would say the universities did whatever they could. The lockdown came, it was a matter of law. We were all obliged to stay at home. Classes and lectures could not continue. Are you saying that what they did was an unsatisfactory response to the pandemic, or are you simply saying that you should have your money back?
I'd say it's an unsatisfactory response to the pandemic. I think quite a lot of people join me in my view that they could have said, why don't we all wait a year until things are more settled and we've sort of got our act together a bit more, and then we can try this again. Because we got the sense they're very much making it up as they went along. And that's obviously not what we paid for.
Yes. If this case was successful, what do you hope you would get? I mean, is it as simple as saying your money back or much of your money back?
Well, we're not asking for all of our money back because obviously the university has eventually provided us with the education we wanted, although it's happened 2 years later than I'd originally hoped. So we're sort of asking for a fraction of what we paid back. Which I believe is wholeheartedly reasonable.
And is there a danger that if you do get some of your money back, that you will impoverish the universities, which will then be less able to provide education to the students who follow you?
Not at all. The universities, I think, I might be wrong on this, but I read somewhere that universities across the UK are sitting on £44 billion worth of profit from the pandemic. So I think, a fraction of what students have paid in tuition fees will be a drop in the ocean of that sum.
Richard, what was the significance of the case in the High Court this week? As I understand it, was brought against University College London, but that was presumably a symbolic or lead or specimen case.
It wasn't a test case as such, but it will set a precedent for the other cases. So essentially the significance was all the universities so far are saying the students shouldn't have access to the courts. They should all be forced to go into or strongly encouraged to go into the internal complaints procedures of the universities themselves. Now, these are universities that have denied all liability to pay any compensation, and they want to be both the defendant and the judge. So no one in law can force the students to do this, but the universities are using this as spoiler tactics and delaying tactics by saying that the proceedings should be halted until the students have actually been strongly encouraged to do that. And they've already been encouraged by the universities, and it's not a tempting offer. And many students have already been through the procedure before coming to us. So what happens with them? Do they not get access to the court as well?
We asked the Department for Education for a statement, and a spokesman commented, if any student is unhappy with the standard of education they're getting, they should take their complaints to the university. This sounds as though actually the government is on the side of the universities, because the university's argument is that internal complaints procedures should be used, not the law.
Yes, that is their argument. But at the same time, the government flip-flops. I mean, Gavin Williamson, for instance, when he was Education Secretary, was saying to the universities, get back to in-person teaching. These guys, the students are going to concerts, they're doing all sorts of things that they can do in groups. And the university just got addicted to online learning, because if they're not restricted as to the number of students they can fit in a lecture theatre, they can take on more students. So, for instance, UCL made 41% more profit or more turnover from tuition fee revenue over this period than before. So they made loads more money. The first 18 universities we've looked at made more than £1 billion of profit over the pandemic period.
Well, on this programme, we have been following this case, and we will doubtless come back to it when we have that decision from the High Court. Meanwhile, thanks to Harriet Patano, Heathcote and Richard Dunleavy. Summertime. What a wonderful world. Cheek to cheek. Dream a little dream of me. Hello, Dolly. Are just some of the iconic songs that you may remember by the legendary American musician Louis Armstrong. Over 50 years after his death, the American icon's only child, Sharon Preston Falter, appears in the acclaimed PBS and Emmy-nominated documentary Little Satchmo. After living closely in the shadows of her father, Armstrong's secret daughter reveals a family and relationships that were kept entirely discreet. The documentary had its premiere in the United Kingdom this week, and I'm joined by Sharon now, live from Florida. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning, your time. It's great to have you on GB News.
Well, thank you, and I'm very happy to be here.
Tell me about your mother. Your father was married to another woman at the time that you were born. Who was your mother, and what was the relationship between Louis Armstrong and your mother?
My mother was Lucille Sweets Preston. She was a performer in Black vaudeville, and she was married to Luther Preston, and who they called him Slim. And they had a dance team called Slim and Sweets, and they toured in the 40s. So my mother and her husband, Slim, were part of the entertainers that traveled together. And here in the States, especially in the South, all Black performers, whether you were the opening act or the star of the show, you all stayed together, you ate together, you stayed in people's homes due to, Jim Crow. So everyone really became friends. So Mom and Sweets were friends with Louis and Lucille, Mom and Slim. And they performed with him, and everybody just hung out. So that's how they got to know each other. And unfortunately, my mother's husband passed in 1950. And it was at that point that my mother and father, their relationship changed and went in another direction.
Louis Armstrong acknowledged you, did he not? He was anxious to care for you. He was anxious about your welfare, and he made a commitment to your mother, including buying her a house, I think. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. From the time they started seeing each other, he supported her. He supported us financially through his life, and there was even money left for us after he passed for a short period. He was very generous. He bought us a home through his manager, Mr. Glazier, and we lived in Mount Vernon, and I had an upper middle class life. So I was very fortunate. My mother was a stay-at-home mom when that was, what was done in that day, and she was able to do it, and we had a home. So it was, there were great opportunities, but we just didn't see him a lot, of course. But
And
when
Sharon,
we did, it was really special.
Oh, that's lovely. But Sharon, there was a moment, I think, when you realised that the relationships involved here were more complex than you've been led to believe. I mean, you didn't realise at first, of course, that Louis Armstrong was married to another woman, did you?
I had no idea. All I knew was he was working, and I would see him because we watched him on TV. We saw articles in magazines. So even though he wasn't physically with us, he was present. I saw that he was working. And when I was, from the time I was a toddler to 7 years old until we moved to Mount Vernon, every summer we would travel with him on the bus in various places in the United States. And he was able to bring Mom and I for an extended period of time with him. So I got to be with him in hotels and watch the shows, sometimes from the back, or sometimes in the front, and it was a great experience. I mean, it was always the music that made me feel that he was, he was there more than he was. So at age, at age 10, I actually saw that I was watching Johnny Carson. My mother was watching Johnny Carson, and my father came on for an interview, and he started speaking about Lucille. And just the circumstances and everything just did not sound right. And even I was in another room. I ran to my mother and asked her, and she just looked at me and said, "Yes, but he loves us. She won't give him a divorce." And it was hardly spoken about.
Goodness, what an extraordinary way to make that discovery. Did you play musical instruments? Did you play musical instruments with Louis Armstrong at any point?
I never played with him, but he would listen to me play. I did play the accordion for him on occasion when he came to the house. But, he was a little intimidating to play for.
Yes, I can imagine that. How would you describe your connection, or to some extent your lack of connection, with your father?
My connection, I always knew, even whether he was with me or not, that he cared, because he communicated a lot through his letters and his audio letters that he would send on reel-to-reel tape. And when I was with him, it was always special. But, as I grew older, it just remained just more surfacey, But I would say that, we shared a love and an excitement to see one another.
And this has now been made into a remarkable documentary, which we now have the opportunity to see in the United Kingdom. You are, of course, the star of that documentary. It's based on the book that you wrote about all of this. It's been a real privilege to have you on so early in the morning, your time. Thank you very much, Sharon Preston Falter. You're watching Sunday with Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, Tate Britain has unveiled a rehang of 800 of its works this week. Has the art on display been politicised? That's after the break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back to Sunday with Michael Portillo. This week, Tate Britain in London has unveiled a complete rehang of its collection of British art for the first time in 10 years. Visitors can see more than 800 works by more than 350 artists across 6 centuries. Pieces by John Everett Millais, David Hockney and Barbara Hepworth are joined by new additions in a move said to reflect the diversity of the Tate's collection. Nevertheless, this new hang has opened the question of whether the choices are influenced by the politics, indeed the culture wars of today. Old art, previously overlooked, has been revisited with issues like colonialism, slavery and race on curators' minds. And new art by LGBTQ+ and female artists is incorporated in the display, reflecting a new urge to present diversity. I'm joined now by the art critic J.J. Charlesworth. JJ, you wrote a pretty fierce article about this, but interestingly, very heavily criticised in The Spectator, heavily criticised in The Guardian as well. What is it that you're all saying? Are you all saying the same thing?
I think what's very striking about this new rehang is the emphasis that it puts on British social and political history, going back to 1550, and at one level, I would say that it's good to have some context when you're looking at very old artworks, because, of course, it's very difficult to know how they were made, what was going through an artist's mind, what was going on in the artistic culture of the time. But what's really striking, and I think a bit of a problem, is quite how emphatic and overbearing the idea of the various episodes in British history of the last 500-600 years are in this hang. It goes from looking at the art of Charles, the period of Charles I and Henry VIII, very much from the perspective of migration, because artists were moving to and fro Britain from Europe. It goes on to be very, very focused on the period between the late 1700s and definitely the period where colonialism and slavery were a big issue in British politics. And it's very concerned to tell us about those periods in British history which are very contentious now, looking back. So issues of race, of the representation of women, of the way in which artworks didn't or did reflect periods in colonial and imperial history in Britain, they're all kind of written up and presented to you as if that's the main event. And there is a bit of an aspect to it which seems to lead you not really to pay attention too much to whether the artworks are any good. That's a real issue. Because there are some artworks are drawn out in order to make the point, in order to kind of focus you on a discussion about, say, the suffragette movement or the period after the abolition or leading up to the abolition of slavery. So you have paintings which are not necessarily that great, but because they, for example, have a black subject in one, or present the art of a suffragette campaigner, Annie Swinnerton, for example, they're presented for their value as social documents. And I think that's a bit of a problem, because in the end, are we talking about artworks which are interesting and exciting and good to see, or are we there to be given a talk about how we should think about British history? So I think there's a bit of a tension there between what the art gallery is there for. And it seems to me that the Tate is opting more now to teach us about history rather than teach us about artworks.
I think you even ended up in what you wrote, saying that you thought the Tate Britain wasn't really keen on its own collection, that it felt very uncertain about its own collection.
I think we're living in a period where people are very ambiguous about what it is to be British, what Britain's history is, how it should be represented, how it should be understood, whether it should be valued, whether it should be criticised. So there is a very kind of contemporary aspect to how Tate Britain, which is, of course, has to look after British art, right? It's not just a collection of historical works, it's a collection of historical British works in large part. And Tate Britain is trusted with that collection. So there is a real issue about whether the curators are less interested in talking up the values and virtues of their collection than using it to score points in what is a very heated and, as you say, culture wars style debate about how we should understand British history.
I find a sort of generational arrogance in this, the feeling that what we think today is self-evidently superior to what was thought by people in previous eras. When I was reading history, I was taught about a thing called historicism, which is broadly the idea that all of history was about leading up to the present moment, not understanding that the present moment is just a moment in history and will soon be scrutinised by historians of the future. Do you get that feeling that really it isn't suitable for an art collection covering centuries to be so governed by a concern which is of the moment? We don't know how long the moment is, but it is of the moment.
I think that it's very clear that there are biases and emphases in the way in which these moments and periods are talked about. I think, for example, what's perhaps most sort of frustrating are the rooms which are dealing with the period between the period in which abolition where slavery was current and up until the period of European revolutions in the 1830s and around then. Because what you notice is that the constant refrain in the way in which it's written up, because you're reading the wall labels for each painting, and they have a lot to say about this. You notice that the style and the tone of it is quite downbeat. It's always kind of rehearsing the fact that people were enslaved, that there was colonial domination and so on. But at the same time, you're dealing with an epoch in which the rights of man, liberty, equality and fraternity were major issues, which actually drove a lot of the way in which people thought about what the future could be and how society could progress. And I think what's really lacking in this, even though it's a progressive chronological ordering of British art, is a very real sense that there's no real progress in British society. And that's obviously very reflective of some of the things that we're pointing to in current controversies.
It is an extraordinary era. Because, as you say, this is the period in which liberalism begins, but also, of course, abolition of the slave trade in 1807, abolition of slavery in the British Empire, if I recall, in 1834. Anyway, you and others have been pretty critical, but you might want to judge for yourself by going down to Tate Britain to see the new hang. Thanks to J.J. Charlesworth. Coming up, what's it like to photograph some of the world's most famous figures, including David Bowie, Bob Dylan, Nelson Mandela and the royal family? I'll be joined by Richard Young, who's been capturing images of celebrities for nearly half a century. That's after the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you very much. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Some breaking news this hour. 2 men who were rescued off the coast of Torbay yesterday have died. Devon and Cornwall Police says the pair in their 20s were pulled from the water at Oddicombe. 1 man was declared dead at the scene. The second died in hospital. Their next of kin have been informed. ITV sources have told GB News bosses have just 7 days to save this morning following the fallout surrounding Philip Schofield. Staff members who raised concerns say executives need to prove they're properly addressing the issue and they'll need to win back the trust of viewers. It's as new details have emerged about the presenter's relationship with a runner who was reportedly 15 years old when they first met. The Mail on Sunday says Philip Schofield arranged an interview for him, which resulted in a job when he turned 18. The affair started later. The government is launching an ad campaign to stop people from crossing the channel. The advert, set to be circulated in Albania next week, will warn people they face being detained and removed if they make the journey. Critics have already branded it as pointless, saying it won't deter them. A record number of people made the crossing in small boats last year, and more than 6,000 have been intercepted so far this year. Meanwhile, Labour says it would impose time limits on hiring overseas workers in a bid to curb migration. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has told the Sunday Telegraph it would serve as an incentive to train British workers. She also suggested the party would ask the Migration Advisory Committee for appropriate timescales for importing labour. 7 people have been charged with the attempted murder of a police officer in County Tyrone. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell was shot several times at a sports centre in Omagh in February. 2 men were also charged for being members of the IRA and 3 others with the preparation of terrorist acts. All 7 men will appear in court via video link tomorrow. You can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you to Tatiana Sanchez. The photographer Richard Young has played a significant part in mapping the celebrity culture of Britain and the United States over nearly 50 years. He's had an interesting career capturing images of the world's icons, from Freddie Mercury to Serge Gainsbourg and Marvin Gaye to Madonna. For his very first job, he gate-crashed Richard Burton's 50th birthday party at the Dorchester Hotel in London in 1975, from which he was eventually thrown out by Liz Taylor. He later became friends with Liz Taylor, who allowed him to photograph her whenever she was in London. To hear his story, I'm joined now in the studio by Richard Young, and you've even brought a camera with you.
Yeah, my good old faithful Leica is with me.
Really? How old and faithful is that? Is that what you started?
Well, this one is pretty new. It's called a Q2. They've been on the market for about a couple of years now, Q1, Q2s, and only in the last week they brought out the new Q3, which I'm hoping that maybe one day I'll be able to afford to buy.
When did you first sell a photograph for a decent amount of money?
It was 1974. It was of I was with some friends who introduced me to a young chap called Paul Getty Jr. and he just had been released by the mafia in Italy and he was minus 1 ear. And we all went out for lunch to the Hard Rock Cafe and we were walking through Hyde Park and I took some pictures of him. I was still in my learning period of how to use a camera and we sold the pictures with his permission to the Evening Standard and that was the beginning. again. And the Evening Standard would then call me maybe 2 or 3 times a week and send me on, you know, small assignments, which was very fruitful. But for that, even for the world exclusive on Paul Getty, which everybody was searching for him, they gave me £30. To me, at that time, that was a lot of money.
You were obviously very bold. I've just told half the story of you gate crashing the Richard Burton's 50th birthday party. Tell me about that. How did you actually gate crash it? Were you disguised or what?
No, I wasn't disguised. And strangely enough, I was wearing a suit for a change, which I think helped the situation. And I had the corduroy suit on. I was at the Dorchester Hotel, being told by the publicist at the Dorchester Hotel, and there was 3 other photographers there, but they were all star photographers, and they really basically wanted to go home. Would you mind leaving? So they left, and I just wandered off because I just wandered off. I saw this young assistant of the PR going through some glass doors, and I've always been told if you see a door, go through it, because they can only turn you back. And I went through these glass doors, and eventually I ended up in this ballroom, which was pretty empty at the time, and the only person there at the time was the DJ. And I went up to him, I told him my gate crashed, and he said, well, put your camera down, and this is how the record play, this is how it all works. So now I become the assistant DJ. But I knew then, don't take any pictures when they come in or anything. Wait until you see the birthday cake with 50 candles on it, because obviously that is the picture to be taken, which is what I did. And I took some pictures when it did arrive, and Elizabeth Taylor came over to me because she saw my flash. She could see it was much more bigger than all the guests' flash. So, and what happened was she said to me, would I mind leaving? She wasn't very happy, but her nose nearly touched my nose when she was telling me this. And the secret was, don't say a word, just turn and walk. So I did. And of course, about a week later or 2 weeks later, I got a phone call again from the Dorchester saying how naughty I was and everything else. And would I mind terribly, I knew this was coming, can we have some prints so we can send them to Miss Taylor in Los Angeles? And of course, I rushed out, made up about half a dozen prints, took them to the Dorchester, and they sent them on to Miss Taylor. About a year later, I saw her in London, and she said to me, you were very, very, very naughty, but thank you for sending the photographs.
Because they were so good.
They were so good, and we got quite friendly, and she forgave me and everything, and in actual fact became very good friends with her. Up until the year 2000, I was doing various things with her. In the year 2000, her attorney called me from Los Angeles and asked me if I was in London for the next week. I said yes. Well, Miss Taylor's coming to London. She wants you to be her official photographer to come to the Dorchester for the official lunch with her close family, taking pictures because she was just she was becoming a dame by the Queen, and would I do all the pictures? And I did.
Tell me about your philosophy of photographing celebrities, because, obviously, as you became more famous, you weren't gate-crashing parties.
No.
You were taking your time. You were getting them relaxed. You were trying to see them in their most natural behaviour, most natural environment. Tell me about how you would approach a celebrity.
First of all, 3 things. Have a sense of humour, all right? Always have a smile on your face. Always be polite. And just be kind. Just don't hound them. Don't get too close to them, in the sense of never let them become too friendly with you, or you become too friendly with them, because then you're crossing a certain line and everything else, and it becomes a little bit more personal. Just be a nice guy. There's a lot of wise guys out there doing the job who are making a real kind of hash of it, right? But I've learned that if you're nice to everybody and polite to everybody, using the 2 very big words in my life, please and thank you, it gets you everywhere.
Tell me about the changing nature of celebrity, because I get the idea that you very much admired the people you were photographing at first, but now there are people around you don't even know why they're famous.
Well, most of the time, I don't know who anybody is.
Nowadays?
Pardon?
Nowadays.
Nowadays.
Yes.
But I took my daughter with me. To the Oscars this year. We had the most fabulous time. We were shooting the Versace fashion show and party in West Hollywood. And we're walking around, and I promise you, I didn't know who anybody was, right? But I'm so happy I took her with me because she pointed everybody out to me, all these rap stars, all these other celebrities who she knew because it was her culture and it was her age group, right? And I'm going, who are these people? She said, Dad, don't worry, just photograph them. And I did, and it made it the most incredible evening ever. I mean, it was funny at one point, she said to me, go and photograph that lady over there, that's Cher. I said, darling, I know who Cher is.
Because she was the right generation.
She was my generation.
I don't know, let's pick someone at random. What was it like to photograph Freddie Mercury?
Freddie Mercury was very special to my life and very special to many, many people's lives. He was the most kindest and most gentlest person you could ever wish to have met or work with. I was very fortunate to be like a somewhat kind of in-house photographer for him for 11 years. He was absolutely magnificent. Not just Freddie Mercury, the whole band, Queen itself as a unit were fantastic. You know, I got on really well with them, and I'd be on the road with them on various occasions, in Budapest, in Ireland, and other locations. And if they knew that you were sitting in your dressing room, in your bedroom, and it was like everybody's going out for dinner, I always got the call saying, "We're all in the lobby. Come and meet us. We're all going out for dinner." So they made you part of the situation, and I was so thrilled and so proud to be part of the Freddie Mercury and Queen situation for 11 years, up until the day he died, sadly. And
you must have produced some absolutely extraordinary images, which have passed into history. Richard, so good to have you here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Congratulations on what's approaching 50 years.
Yeah, 50 years.
Photography. You're watching Sunday with Michael Portillo on GB News, Britain's news channel. Coming up, I'll be joined by an award-winning designer who was commissioned by McVitie's to fashion a cake for Their Majesty's coronation. After the break.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Earlier this month, we celebrated the crowning of King Charles and Queen Camilla. The coronation took lots of planning, not least the coronation cake commissioned by McVitie's, which took 5 months to conceive. I'm joined now by Rosalind Miller, an award-winning cake designer and former arts lecturer at Central St Martin's, who started her business running a stall in Greenwich Market.
That's right.
Welcome to GB News. That's quite a journey.
It's been an incredible journey, to be honest, yes.
Tell me about the stall in Greenwich Market. What were you selling?
I was selling cupcakes. I'd been made redundant from my lecturing job, and I'd seen the cupcakes in New York and thought, oh, I could do that. I had to put my daughter through university, so, yeah, I knew I could bake a nice cake, so that's what I did. I started baking cupcakes, and it went really sort of like... They became a real trend, but the first time we went there, we put little flowers on, sugar flowers, and I think nearly everyone in Greenwich came and said, I've heard about these wonderful cakes. So, yeah, it was really popular, and it all started from there.
When do you think you reached the status, the reputation that you might be turned to collaborate in a coronation cake?
Well, it took a while. I mean, I was doing the markets for about 3 or 4 years, a lot of hard work. I'm standing out in the wind and the rain. And I started doing wedding cakes because my background is as an artist and designer. And it was just a bigger canvas to work on. And I got sort of noticed very quickly, I think because they were different, because I came from a design background, so they weren't sort of the run-of-the-mill cakes. Yes, and we got picked up by Harrods, and we got a studio. I work with my daughter, Yasmin. She runs the business side of the business, and no, cake has been amazing, taken me to royal palaces in the Middle East and, yeah, Windsor Castle for the King's coronation.
Tell me about the concept of the cake, because it's in 4 pieces and each of them is very significant.
That's right. So we looked, to start with, I wanted it to be more about... I went to the Tower of London. I did a bit of research and I went and saw the crown jewels, and I started to realise the historical significance of the ceremony, which is... I mean, everyone's talked about it, but it's been, you know, it's the only one in Europe that stayed unchanged. So we wanted to incorporate parts of the actual ceremony and the ceremonial objects that are used in the cake. So the base of the cake is sort of designed to represent the Stone of Destiny.
Yes.
So it's got a sort of stonework texture. And then as you move up the cake, there was a design which is taken from the anointing spoon, which is one of the only objects that wasn't sort of melted down. And so that's got that design on, and then as you move up the cake, that we've taken there's a beautiful design on the actual chair, the throne, the coronation throne, and we sort of replicated that in gold leaf on the cake. And then at the top is a orb, which was made by a ceramics artist, actually, Nico Conti, and that was 3D printed. But yeah, so each sort of tier of the cake, as you went up from the Stone of Destiny at the base, and you get higher and higher up towards the heavens, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
And why did it take 5 months to conceive?
It was a lot of talking and designing and, you know, designing and going back to the palace and them saying, oh, you know, can we have it smaller or larger or...
And what's inside it?
It was fruitcake.
Right, but that's to understate it. Tell me a bit about the processes
well, the
that
fruitcake
went
was actually made by McVitie's, so they made it. So it was a rich fruitcake, and I think they used as much as possible as they could from sort of duchy of Cornwall and things like that. So, yeah, they bake that. And as well as, so that was the base tier. And we also made, I think, 300 odd little mini fruitcakes as well to go with it to serve to the guests.
And a fruitcake has to be matured and allowed to settle.
You know your cake.
Well, I've just read a tiny bit about it, but that process itself is a few months, isn't it?
It takes a few months. If you don't let it sort of mature and you feed it with alcohol, so they used an apple cognac type liqueur to feed it. If you don't let it mature, when you cut into it, it just sort of crumbles. So fruitcake can last for years and years and years because of the amount of fruit and the amount of alcohol in it.
Do you have any idea what's happened to the cake since?
I don't. I don't.
You don't?
I'm afraid,
you don't?
no.
So you haven't seen it being cut into or anything like that? No, we
delivered it and, yeah, and that was that.
How do you deliver a coronation cake of that size? Well, for a start, did it go in separate pieces? I wouldn't want to commit the whole thing to a single vehicle.
No, it went in separate pieces because the base tier was about, I don't know, 22 inches wide and a square, and it took 3 people to lift it. It was so heavy. So, yes, we took each tier separately and then assembled it on site in the kitchens at Windsor Castle.
You said that you've been taken to royal palaces around the world. It's amazing what cake has done for you. But presumably this has been the pinnacle of your cake career so far.
Definitely, definitely. It was like, to be asked to do that, it was, yeah, no, it was definitely the pinnacle of my career, definitely.
And does a person like you still have any challenges, any targets you'd like to achieve still?
Just keep on designing and creating new designs and different sort of styles.
Right, I am terribly sorry to interrupt, but someone told me it's your birthday, Michael Portillo.
Well, it has been my birthday.
It's a milestone birthday, I won't say. That would be rude. But this wonderful cake has appeared, and I believe Rosalind may well have designed it herself. Fit for a king.
Rosalind, that is so sweet
You're
of you.
You're very welcome.
Emily, you've taken me completely by surprise.
Well, happy birthday.
And luckily, we have one of the greatest photographers in the world here to record the event. It says, it says, "Happy birthday, Michael." Let me just lift that up so the camera can see it. Ah, I'm afraid it's going to slide.
No, yeah, don't be careful.
You designed this. This is the most beautiful
I designed it. It's pink champagne flavour inside.
Pink champagne?
Pink champagne, yes. And
tailor-made.
We call it Monet's Garden.
Let us, when the show is ended, set upon it, all of us. And,
we're
going to have the most marvellous time. But thank you very much, Rosalind.
Thank you very much.
Emily Carver, thank you so much for this. You are coming on in a few moments. What are you doing on your show?
Well, I've forgotten with all this excitement. So what are we going to be talking about? There's been quite a lot in the news about what Keir Starmer wants to do if he gets power. One is no new licences for oil and gas. Now, that is the #1 ask of the campaign group Just Stop Oil. So, will we be seeing Just Stop Oil in power if Labour get in one way or another? You could say that. We're also going to be looking at price controls in supermarkets. This is apparently something that Rishi Sunak, Conservative Prime Minister, is considering. So we're getting stuck into that. And, of course, the very latest on the showbiz drama. That is ITV's This Morning.
Right. Camilla was talking today about the net zero policy, and there are those who think it's going to be absolutely disastrous, in particular disastrous for Western democracies. But apparently Keir Starmer still thinks that all the votes are in greenery. What do you make of that?
I mean, there are a lot of votes in greenery. We are very divided, aren't we, when it comes to net zero? I imagine if there were a referendum, it would be half-half.
Yeah, well, the Labour Party's decided where it's going to put its money. Look, I want to thank all my guests today, and I want to say a very special thank you for this lovely cake, Rosalind.
Very well.
I will be back again on the 11th of June, so it's a short while until I'll be back, and I say goodbye to all our viewers, and thank you to all of you in the studio. Bye-bye.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vaughtry here with your latest GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. I hope you've been enjoying the long weekend so far. There has been a lot of fine weather around thanks to high pressure that's been with us and is staying with us throughout the rest of Sunday and into Monday as well. Whilst it's staying largely dry, we do just have this slight squeeze in the ice bars across the southern half of the UK, so the breeze is going to be strengthening throughout this evening and overnight. So just be aware if you're out camping out here. Elsewhere, the cloud will be melting away throughout the night and we'll see a good number of clear intervals developing. That will allow temperatures to just drop off ever so slightly overnight. Most towns and cities will be down in single figures, but there is the risk of a patchy rural frost for parts of northern England, Northern Ireland and Scotland as well. Despite that slightly cool, chilly start, though, there will be a good number of sunny intervals as we kick off the bank holiday